What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to a special episode of Faith Unaltered. We're doing the AM discussion today with Dr. Ryan Mullins on the topic of divine temporality. Joining me is my co-host, Dale. Dale, what's going on, brother? It's nice to see you, actually, instead of just a picture of you. So thanks for being here in presence with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's great to be here as well, even though, I feel like I could use a little bit of divine timelessness myself right now because I'm a bit tired. It's early in the morning, but I think it'll be a great show. Obviously, I enjoy the subject of God and time.
Yeah.
I think it's, two of the most fascinating subjects put together. So, I mean, what there's so much to love about this. So, yeah.
It's definitely not the easiest two subjects, and like I was telling Dr. Mullins right before we went on, I respect this dude in a way that I've never really respected anybody before, just because of the subject matter and the amount of work and time, no pun intended, that it's taken to really dive deep into this topic like you do. And so I appreciate that from my perspective on things, and with a Eastern Orthodox perspective, there was definitely things I was like, yes, and there was definitely things I was like, oh man, in your book. And so I'm excited to talk with you about the broad spectrum of everything. And so I appreciate you being here. For those who don't know you, Dr. Mullins, can you just give a brief introduction about what you are and what got you, or about who you are, and what got you into the subject of the philosophy of time?
So I'm a lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Lucerne, also in philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and then I'm a docent of dogmatics at the University of Helsinki. I've got a PhD in theology from St. Andrews and a doctoral habilitation in dogmatics from Helsinki. So I do a lot of philosophy and theology stuff, basically, is the short answer for that. What got me interested in all this philosophy of time stuff was I was in high school, and my English teacher had us read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And there's this chapter on God and time in there. And just something about that discussion that day on that chapter really blew my mind. And it was one of the first moments as a teenager where I really felt called to worship God. And so I just wanted to know more about this topic, and eventually got obsessed and did 2 PhDs in it. So, that's as you do.
Right. Fair enough. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's in your preface or introduction of The End of the Timeless God that you write about that experience, about being in the classroom, and it's like nobody is getting it. And then the teacher describes really what the impact and what it means to be eternal. And you say, I think, that you see light bulbs start clicking on in everybody's mind. And it's just this concept. The thing that got me the most about your book, and I'll put a link in the description for those who want to check it out, is that the concept of divine simplicity and classical theism and the concept of divine timelessness, those two things, like, they're inseparable, it seems like. Is that fair to say?
You can separate them in principle, and I can
Okay.
give examples of people who do, but I got really annoyed when I was trying to go through and assess like what's going on in the Western tradition. Because here's what you've got. So you've got Catherine Rogers, who's this contemporary classical theist. She's a medieval philosopher. And she says so much of contemporary philosophy of religion is not systematic at all. It's just very piecemeal. You're like, I'll solve a problem over here. How does it connect to anything else I have to say? I don't know. And I just thought, no, Kate, you're wrong. You're wrong about that. That's not true. And then I started reading through all the discussions. Like, she's absolutely right. This is the most deeply unsystematic way of approaching these things. So since I was doing a PhD in systematic theology, I thought, okay, let's try to figure out how to be systematic about this. And what I noticed throughout Western history is these doctrines typically, not always, but almost always, go hand in hand. So let's look at the systematic connections they have with each other, because that's the way it plays out in Christian doctrine, is these things are all supposed to be systematically connected to each other. So some kind of package deal.
Right. It definitely seems that way. And for these guys to kind of treat it the opposite and look at it just kind of piecemeal, like you said, that's interesting to me, because growing up Protestant, like, it seems like systematic theology is the way to do things. But whenever you're taken out of that context and put it in their context, that could be a whole game changer in and of itself, it seems like.
Yeah, it really is. And then also what you don't notice until you see the connections yourself. a lot of moves, a lot of strategies, a lot of arguments and talking points that people bring up, they are assuming these other doctrines in the background. And so I thought,
Right.
well, we didn't make this explicit so people can see this is what's going on.
Right, right. No, I appreciate that. The End of the Timeless God, that's your book. And then you are releasing another book. I think you have it written, is that right? And now it's just in the editing phase. And okay, fair enough. Is there anything you want to say about that before we actually dive into this topic?
Yeah, so I just finished copy editing. It's called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker. It's an exploration in divine temporality. So you're going to get a very full scale, systematic development of a whole host of issues related to creation, the Trinity, providence, life after death, and divine temporality, and a lot of philosophy of time. But yeah, it should be out in a few months. I just finished the copy editing a couple days ago. They have to typeset it now. I already picked out like the really ugly book cover because they gave me the worst options. So it's gonna look dumb, but hey, the content is what matters. It's what's on the inside that matters, right?
I noticed that Dr. Rob Solberg a long time ago sent me. He was trying to get a bunch of people to figure out what the design of his book should look like, and he sent like I think there were 20 different options, and he's like, pick couple. And I was like, none of them look good. Like, who do you got doing this for you? But
yeah.
I feel the pain on that. Dale, real quick before we get into this topic, real quick, if you have not, wait till after this interview, obviously, for our audience. But we've got a lot. I think this is our what are we up to now, Dale? Like, is this number 7 that we've done on the topic of time? I know we've done a couple with Dr. David Bradshaw, Dr. Nathan Jacobs. We had Dr. William Lane Craig on. So maybe we're at 5 with you, Dr. Mullins. So I'm going to make a playlist because we're starting to get up in that number on this topic. I want to make a playlist and put everybody on that playlist so it's easy to find. So I might do that this weekend for anybody that's interested in that. But go check out these other perspectives. Like I said, I find this topic extremely fascinating. The other announcement that I have, just real quick, and I'll turn it over to my co-host, is that we now, since we hit the 4,000 subscriber mark, we are now offering memberships for those who expressed interest to me either on here or through email that they would like to donate monthly to our ministry and help fund us. We do now have that available. And so I wanted to make that quick announcement. So if you go to our, I think it's just on our home channel, just Faith Unaltered, by the subscribe button, you should see a blue membership button. And if you click that, then I think I've only got 2 tiers set up, and they're super cheap. So I think the low tier is $2.99, and the medium tier is $4.99 if I'm not mistaken. So $3, $5. If you can do that, please consider doing that on a monthly basis, and that would really help fund our ministry. We're trying to get enough money to save up for a website, and so that's the next big thing on our projects. And other than that, I really don't have nothing else. Dale, what's going on, my friend?
Yeah. So on my end, I've been quite busy actually. I over on Real Seekers, so I've been doing a bunch of podcasts. I think this is within a period of a week. Literally, I think this is my 7th show. So yeah, I've been busy doing a lot of shows on a whole bunch of topics. I had my debate with Dr. Shabir Ali on historicity of the crucifixion, and that was a great time. Gary Habermas said he was proud with how I did.
Good.
What else? I'm blanking, but I had Otangelo Grasso on the show talking about his new book on the fine tuning argument, and a whole host of things. I don't want to bore Ryan with too much details, but yeah, basically I've covered the whole breadth of Christian apologetics in a week. So
Fair enough. An intro book will be coming out soon from Dell on the broad topic of Christianity in general. So now I'm just playing. All right, let's dive into this, guys. So my first question for you, Dr. Mullins, I'm super interested because you don't take a traditional perspective on a few different things in your book anyway. So for those who may not have read The End of the Timeless God or other articles and papers you've written on the subject, could you give just a brief summary about your ideas about God in relation to time specifically?
Yeah. So what I do in the End of the Timeless God is, first step is just define what it means to be timeless, because far too many discussions don't want to define their terms, and that's just, you're not going to get anywhere by doing that.
Right.
So to be eternal is to exist without beginning and without end, and that's not terribly
Mhm.
controversial. Like everyone who says God exists is, almost always says God's eternal. You get a few nut jobs here or there who deny that, but everyone says God's eternal. That's not the interesting part, though. The interesting part is when people want to make additional claims above and beyond that God exists without beginning and without end. So if you want to say God's timeless or temporal, that's where things get interesting. So if you want to say God's timeless, you have to say God exists without succession. So God doesn't do one thing and then another and then another. And then you have to say God exists without temporal location. So he doesn't exist right now. He doesn't exist in the past. He doesn't exist in the future. Uh, you have to deny that he's got any sort of temporal relations of any sort. So he can't be simultaneous with anything, and he can't exist earlier than or later than, because you don't really do a good job at being timeless if you're earlier than something,
Before creation, for example.
Yeah, before creation is a
Yeah.
big one. So I make a big deal about that in the book. And so if you want to say God's temporal, on the flip side of that, you say God can have succession. God can do one thing after another. And God can exist right now. He can have temporal location. He can be temporally related to things. So what I do in the End of the Timeless God is I go, okay, cool. Here's what we mean by timelessness. Now let's see, does that actually fit with basic Christian doctrine and with any of the main theories in the philosophy of time? Because this was the really controversial part, was everyone at that point was saying God can be timeless if the A theory is false and the B theory is true. A theory, B theory are meaningless distinctions. I can talk about that, if those meaningless distinctions, if you want. But there's supposed to be this meaningful distinction between the A theory and B theory.
Right.
And everyone's like, yeah, if the B theory is true, then God can be timeless. And I just went, did you forget what the basic content and claims of the B theory are? Clearly you did, because here they are. And then God can't be timeless on that either. And then I threw in the incarnation, because I was like, why not? Let's do that.
Yeah.
Because this is, you've got God taking on a human nature at a particular moment that he was not always being incarnate, and entering into history in a very unique, dramatic way. Is that going to be consistent with timelessness and all the other attributes that are typically kind of clustered in with it?
Right. Right. And so we're not talking. Well, actually, let me back up and let me just
And so
clarify something
then
real
I
quick.
go, God can't be timeless,
Oh, you're kind of
so
robotic.
it must be temporal. What does that mean? I'll tell you in the next book. And so, yeah, I lost you guys for a second.
Okay. I think you're back now, if I'm not mistaken. I see you
Okay, good.
moving. So, okay, I think we're good.
Yeah.
So then just for clarification, so you would differ then
Mhm.
specifically with Dr. William Lane Craig with the idea that sans creation, God exists in a timeless state, but after creation or during creation or however that, flushes out
With creation.
with creation,
Mhm.
God then becomes temporal. That's not your view.
Correct. I don't
Okay.
really criticize that in the End of the Timeless God. I
Right.
only give, I think, like one brief little criticism of it, and move on. Whereas what you'll see in the Divine Time Maker book is I'm going to have a very thorough discussion of why I don't think this view works, and why you should just say God's temporal, full stop, end of story.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So it sounds like then, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, is time is clearly not something that God creates in your view. So is time like this attribute of God, or how would you define time in relation to God sans creation, let's say?
hmm Yeah, so there's two different views you can affirm on this, without saying that God creates time. One is the claim that time is this necessary concomitant of God, like sort of like emanates from God.
Okay.
And there's a lot of people who affirm this view. There's this guy in the 1000s named al-Baghdadi who seems to affirm this view, and then Richard Swinburne. Their views are almost identical on this. And so the claim is time exists, and if and only if there's some sort of thing that exists, some sort of substance that exists. God necessarily exists. Okay, well there you go. You get time, and so so what I call it is the concomitant view, or in some of the papers I called it the Oxford School of Divine Temporality, because you've got Swinburne and then some of his students kind of trying to develop this idea.
Okay.
That's one view. I find it kind of mysterious because it still doesn't really tell me exactly what time is. and I
Okay.
would like an answer to that question, because I get tired of quoting Augustine saying, "I know what time is unless you ask me." Okay, next question, and I'm like, no, like, come on, man, like tell me.
Right.
And so, and I'm tired of like all these discussions in philosophy of time and philosophy of physics where no one's even interested in answering the question, what is time? So like I went to the Higgs Center for Theoretical Physics and I was like, I want to do a conference with you guys on what is time. And they're like, no, we don't know what it is. That's your question. Let's do something else. And I was like, cool. All right, let's do something else.
Wow.
Yeah. So what I did, you'll see a lot in this new forthcoming book, is I really traced down the history of what's called the absolute theory of time. So the absolute theory of time says that time is this uncreated, eternal substance. And it's this natured entity that makes change possible, that explains why change is possible. It is the source of moments, because moments of time are not identical to time. They're moments of time. So it's something unique. So time is the source of these moments. And then time is the thing that orders a series of moments into some sort of coherent timeline. So why does this event happen after this one and after this one and so on? Time is going to explain some of that, is the idea.
Right. Okay.
Now, you're still going to be like, that still feels a little bit mysterious. And here's what I've noticed when I look through the history of the absolute theory of time. There are a significant number of people, some big names too, like Isaac Newton, for example, who say, right, time is an attribute of God. God is that eternal, uncaused substance that makes change possible, is the source of moments. And then whatever theory of providence you want to throw in there, doesn't matter if you're an open theist, a Mollinist, a Calvinist, or something else. That's your story of how God organizes the series of moments into a coherent timeline.
Right.
So you can attribute time to God.
Okay. Fair enough. So it sounds like then there's a specific difference between the time that we experience after creation, right, and the time that exists cotemporary or with God. Is that a fair statement then, or not so much?
I used to think this would be a really interesting difference, and you'll see that in the End of the Timeless God. I make a big deal about the difference between metaphysical time and physical time, and we can talk more about that in a little bit. I don't think it's that interesting anymore, because I think that we often associate lots of different things with when we want to talk about time. Instead of actually talking about time itself, because time itself is actually kind of boring, because it's like, well, there's this thing that makes change possible. And you're like, well, what's it like to experience time? You're like, well, you experience one thing and then another. That's it. And you're like, okay, well, God without creation, is he experiencing one thing and then another? I don't know. Maybe there's a point where he wasn't doing anything at all. And then he's like, hey, let's create stuff. And then he did, and so then there's like succession. And so you're like, okay, well, then he experiences one thing after another.
Right. Okay.
Other stuff that's happening in God's life might be really cool, like the love between the Trinitarian persons, but that has nothing to do with the experience of time.
Right. Exactly. Okay. And we talked about that. I'm going to bring that specifically on the topic of God the Father begetting the Son here in a little bit, but I do want to turn it over to Dale to see if you have any follow-up, Dale, because I know if you want to give a brief summary about because I know you take more of a William Lane Craig model, Dale. So this is going to be an interesting discussion between you two. I'm just agnostic on the whole thing. I find the topic really interesting, but obviously I would take an Eastern Orthodox position, like from the get-go, so I'm not saying that I'm stuck on that. I might be willing to change my mind depending on what's in store. And that's my last question I've got for you. But before I get the cart in front of the horse, Dale, go ahead.
It's just interesting. A lot of what he says makes sense. What Ryan's saying makes sense to me, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I'm very glad to hear that in his book he doesn't refute William Lane Craig's view mostly. Right, this atemporal without creation and then temporal with creation. I think that makes sense. The only one thing I picked up on what you said, you mentioned these moments of time, of absolute time kind of thing, or metaphysical time. Are you appealing to things like chronons or something like that? Because I know William Lane Craig would deny that there is any instant of time or like a part of, time atoms or something like that. So what did you mean by that?
No, he won't deny instants, but he will deny chronons. So my view is agnostic on this. I've gone back and forth on this sort of view. So a moment is, you could take to be an instant, or you could take it to be a chronon. A chronon being the smallest unit of a smallest amount of time or smallest amount of duration, which is something like, depending on which physicist you ask or cosmologist you ask, it could be like negative, or is it 1 to the negative 24ths of a second, something like this. Like, I don't know. But it'd be like some smallest unit of time that's not of zero duration. And Craig's not a big fan of that. There's a separate debate, though, here in the neighborhood that I know Craig has weighed in on a lot more. So is time continuous or is it discrete? And here's something where I'll disagree with Craig on. So discrete time says you've got a moment, then another one, then another one, then another one. Kind of boring, nothing interesting. Continuous time is like, well, in between any moment, there's another moment. And well, in between those two moments, well, there's another moment. And in between those two, and so it just keeps going on ad infinitum. And I'm like, why do I want an infinite regress in my temporal, in my timeline? I don't understand this. And Craig gives this argument that I saw a lot in the latter half of the 20th century. The argument, there's two arguments. One goes, well, time would just be really, really jolty if if it wasn't continuous, if it was discrete. To which I want to say, Craig, I have no idea what it means for time to be jolty. It goes one moment and then another and then another and then another. I don't know where the jolt is coming in. So stop it with the joltiness. I don't know what that means. Here's the second argument, the one that so both of these are really common. It's not just Craig giving these. A lot of people give them. The second one is very prominent to go, well, the continuous theory just fits with our best physical theories. It's the one that the physicists favor, because apparently the physics, even though they're all, many physicists are anti-realist about lots of stuff, apparently they're giving us the real story of the world in useful fictions that they think are not useful. But that's my bringing in my bias there for a second.
I'm right there with you.
I asked a bunch. Yeah, I asked a bunch of physicists about this, and they're like, "Well, yeah, I mean, it makes our equations easier if we make time continuous, because if we make them discrete, we can develop the mathematics for it. It's just more difficult, and I don't want to do it because I got other stuff to do." And I'm like, "Wait." So the philosophers are hanging a whole bunch of stuff on the fact that you're just lazy. You want to make your job easier. You want to make your job easier. That's fine with me. But philosophers pay attention to that's what's going on. Is the physicists are doing things that we all know. It's basic philosophy of science 101, which is we come up with idealized mathematical models because it's easier. And we just need some useful predictions. That's it. So I was like, we're hanging a lot of our philosophy on this. Let me wrap up the last thing about all the anti-physics stuff I said, though. So a lot of stuff in contemporary philosophy of time is really pushed or driven by physics from the 1920s. And you may have noticed it's no longer the year 1920. So why are we kind of doing that? And when you talk to the physicists, they're doing all sorts of interesting kind of projects that none of which fit into a coherent picture of the world. So back in 2004, 2005, I just forget which year now, the Nobel Prize winner for physics, his project was called Space-Time is Doomed. And he just said, look, we know the special theory of relativity is false. We know that all this stuff about space-time, the geometry of space-time is false. We need to replace it with something else. Let's go do that. And so the main project right now is to do that. And so I'm tired of having my philosophy of time based on physical theories that physicists are actively saying, can we please stop with this? We know it's not working. We got to do something else. And yet all the philosophers of time are going, let's stick with it. And I'm like, why? Did you not see that? Well, no, okay. I was going to make a political illusion, but I don't want to do that. Don't you see that this is just not working? Can we please move on to something else?
Del, any other follow-up?
Yeah, so I was trying to find something to show on the screen, but so I know this isn't your interest.
You mean a picture of Biden?
No,
I'll say it. I don't care.
It would have been helpful just for the audience to see it, but I'm kind of interested. So I get you don't really care about the physicist notions of time, but do you want to just kind of describe for the audience that, look, there isn't just one interpretation of time, physical time. There, I think William Lane Craig in his book has a table of at least 8 or 9 different definitions of physical time. Do you want to just kind of outline that for the audience, just so they realize, look, it's not simple in science either?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it as related to one particular issue. So one particular issue is which moments of time exist, and so I want to hold a very traditional view, which is called presentism. Only the present exists. That's it. And Craig, he's a prominent defender of this view as well. And so what you'll see is supposedly the special theory of relativity cannot find the present moment. This is the common claim. Einstein, it took him about, I think it was
Huh.
10 years to be convinced of this because he couldn't figure out the geometry for space-time. And then Minkowski's like, no, bro, this is the geometry you need. And eventually Einstein's like, fine, whatever. So like a common legend you'll hear is like Einstein was really bad at math. So he needed these other people to kind of like try to persuade him this is what's going on. But that was super controversial at the time because you had other physicists who were going, no, this is nuts. This guy named Lawrence was just like, this is completely crazy. What do you mean you can't find the present? Here's the calculations. Here's how you do it. Here's how you find the present. So these debates happen immediately. What you've got now today is you've got lots of different people. So there's this guy named Horshava who apparently in the early 2000s, he's like, yo, this is the easier mathematics to find the present. No big deal. We found it. Next topic. But that's just within special theory. Within the general theory, it's easier to find the present because so a lot of the theories we use to calculate how old the universe is, and a lot of those theories that we use to figure out GPS stuff, like your GPS location devices and everything, those have a natural way to identify the present within it. You can come up with other interpretations where it's difficult to find the present, but but I don't know why you would, but you can. Within quantum physics, same thing. There are different theories where it's easy to find the present, other theories where it's not easy to find the present, and there's huge disagreements on this. And so a big question is, in my mind, is why are any of you ever denying the present? And they're like, well, it's a lesson we learned from special theory. And I'm like, the theory that you think is doomed and we need to replace? That's what I don't understand what you guys are up to, but I'm not a physicist, so I should not like speak too harshly, but I find myself confused on some of these things.
I'll just say philosophy is a second order discipline, so we do have the right to pronounce on that. But yeah,
we've got the right to like just tell everybody you're all wrong. Yeah, sure.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you so much for your answers, and yeah, Tyler, back to you.
All right, no, fair enough. So with special relativity, just a quick follow-up. So the idea, like what we see for our audience that may not know what we're talking about, the idea of the movie Interstellar, where the scene where they go step foot on the planet, right? And then I think it's something like 20 years has passed where 7 minutes has passed. Are you guys saying that's not legit? Like we need to find another model? Or because I kind of missed that part. So is that not true?
So what's going on in Interstellar, I think, is interesting because it brings up the exact point I want to make. So people are like, I can't find the present moment. And we can't come up with like a way to have a framework where we can synchronize all these clocks. And what you see in Interstellar is, well, they figured it out, right? I mean, they figured out how to synchronize the clocks to some extent, right? Like they're like, well, when you go down there, that's going to be 20 years. It's only going to like our clocks are only going to register just a couple minutes. And so I'm like, so you already figured out, and you see this in all of like Christopher Nolan's movies, is he's playing around with all these different things you see in time about clocks being really weird and running at different rates. But he always has absolute simultaneity between events in all of them. So you see this in Interstellar with the example you just gave. Oh gosh, what was the other one where they go into somebody's mind a whole bunch? Oh goodness.
I don't know.
No, it's gone now. It's fine. But yeah, but he does this a lot where he plays around with the weird stuff related to clocks and physics, but he always has absolute simultaneity in the stories, because I don't know how you tell the story otherwise, but yeah, I'm just like, and I'm like, right, that's what we all know to be true. There is simultaneity there. You can do weird stuff with clocks, but they're still present.
I gotcha. So, like, with the idea, and I think in the movie, there's like a little bell that dings every so often. I think it's like every 7 seconds. That means like a year has passed on Earth. And that's kind of like a subconscious thing that your mind's supposed to pick up on to say, look, this is that difference. And that's what you're saying. We found how that relates to them being on that planet versus dude up in the spaceship. And that's what you're calling the concept or the present there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. I appreciate that. All right. So I'm going to skip around on the list that I sent
Mhm.
you, and I'm going to go to question 4 real quick because I brought up orthodoxy just a minute ago. And again, for our audience that may not have seen this, I've done 2 different interviews with Dr. David Bradshaw and Dr. Nathan Jacobs on this topic. But in the End of the Timeless God, so you reference an exact exposition of the Orthodox faith by St. John of Damascus, and it's book 2, chapter 1. And let me quote it real quick, just for our audience, and then I've got a question about it. So you say, or St. John of Damascus writes, quote, this is what you wrote, my bad. Unlike Alan Paget, John of Damascus holds that God is timeless, but much like Paget, he posits that there was time before creation that could not be measured or divided. It is not, nor has it always been, obvious to Christian theologians that time came into existence with creation, end quote. So then transition into a discussion on the difference between physical and metaphysical time. And so my question for you, Ryan, in your opinion, could divine temporality actually be a concept that Eastern Orthodox Christians hold to if they make a distinction between physical and metaphysical time? Or would we have to reform our current understanding of God in total to get to divine temporality?
Yeah, so let me tackle the John of Damascus part first, because I've
Okay.
changed my mind on John of Damascus since writing that book.
Okay.
I thought John of Damascus and John of Scythopolis and some of these others were doing something really cool and utterly unique when they were
Okay.
talking about this age before creation.
Yeah.
Um, I was very wrong on that. They're not
Not so
doing anything
much.
special at all. Yeah, there's
Okay.
nothing unique about what they're saying.
Yeah.
So, as over the last several years, I've been trying to dig into really getting a good understanding of the doctrine of creation out of nothing, not just within Christianity, but within Judaism and Islam. And then also, as that debate plays out between Buddhists and Hindus as well, because they have the same understanding of creation ex nihilo, even though they think it's false. Their intuitions are almost identical. So the doctrine of creation ex nihilo says there is a state of affairs where God exists all alone prior to the existence of the universe. And that what it means to begin to exist, something begins to exist when it is preceded by non-existence. So first there's nothing, and then there's something.
Okay.
And all that John of Damascus is doing is just going, yeah, there's different kinds of ages you can talk about. Like you can talk about like a year, you could talk about like a minute. Well, before creation, there's an age of some sort, but it's without division, it's without like measure, it's without this or that, all the same things he wants to say about God being timeless. And I'm like, oh, all you're just doing is just stating there's God all alone without the universe, and then the universe comes in. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're not special. Like he's a cool guy. Like he's a great theologian, but like on this point, I thought there was something interesting there when I wrote The End of the Timeless God. And I don't think that anymore.
Not so much. Okay.
Yeah. So I find that slightly disappointing because I thought he was doing something really cool and unique, but he's not.
Right.
Anyway, so the difference between metaphysical time and physical time, the distinction is supposed to be something like this. Metaphysical time is supposed to be this thing that like grounds all the ordering relations. So like before and after. So basically, the way I said earlier, the way I described the absolute theory of time is that it's the source of moments, and it's the thing that orders a series of moments into a timeline. Metaphysical time is supposed to be doing that. It's supposed to be this thing that kind of grounds like what happens right now, why this event is earlier or later than this other event, and so on. And the way it's often articulated is that it does not intrinsically or essentially have measurement. Like it's not the sort of thing you could measure unless there are other contingent features added to the world. And I think that's fine. That's consistent with my understanding of the absolute theory of time, is that measurements are things that are features of a timeline. They're not essential features of time itself. It depends what other things are going on in the world.
Okay.
So, for example, if you decide to create a physical universe that has like a law-like regularity by which there's like consistent changes that you can measure with other consistent changes, then you can now develop a clock. So here's the claim. Metaphysical time exists, full stop, end of story. It just does. Can you measure it? It's not essentially like, measurable. Depends what else is going on. If God creates a physical universe, God is creating a clock. And so you can now measure God's life. Now, can an Eastern Orthodox say that? Richard Swinburne said it. Just laid out
Okay.
exactly Swinburne's view, and Swinburne's Eastern
Okay.
Orthodox.
Yeah.
So at least one guy says it. They can say it.
Yeah.
How many people Eastern Orthodox want to say it? I don't know, but at least one guy. Yeah. Now, there's a few other things though. So you asked also, how would you reform your doctrine of God?
Right.
It depends. So if you want to say God does one thing and then another, then you've got divine temporality. That's it. Was
Okay.
God always creating the universe? No, that was a new action. Was God always like sending prophets? No. Every once in a while, he was like, "Hey, Isaiah, come over here. I want to talk to you."
Yeah.
Was he always becoming incarnate? No, that was a new thing he did, and that's just divine temporality. So if you can make these kind of claims, and I know different Eastern Orthodox theologians do make these claims that God performs new actions, new contingent actions that he wasn't always performing. Well, there you go. You've got divine temporality.
Okay. And those, just to clarify, those don't always have to be, how do I want to word this? An extrinsic or an outside action. Could these be thoughts as well? Because the reason I'm asking that, I don't know if I should mention a name and be controversial or not. I might keep it quiet for now, and if I get a little wound up later, I might mention his name. But there was a guy that's on Twitter. He's kind of a big name in Orthodox apologetics. And he basically, I don't know if he misunderstood what I said on a show about affirming mere dynamic omniscience, right? Because if God is free to create, that would seem to entail that, automatically. And so I don't know if he mistook me saying that as, well, now Tyler's affirming open theism, full stop.
Oh, sure.
And saying that that's compatible with orthodoxy, because, like I said, I specifically brought on two scholars, I would say, that are Orthodox Christians, and I asked them both straight up, is God's omniscience dynamic in our view? And both of them said yes. And so I'm like, great, there's divine temporality right there, right? And that is sans creation. If God is free to create and makes the choice to create, it's kind of intuitive at that point, right? God is acting.
Yeah.
And so just to clarify then, what we're saying, that entails not just the act of creation or something that's extrinsic to God. This could be internal factors as well. Is that right?
Correct. Well, I don't think you should say God's actions are extrinsic, partly because I don't know what that means. And typically, actions are considered to be intrinsic to agents. But different kinds of actions, like thoughts, those are, actions.
Right.
I'm thinking stuff right now that's intrinsic to me. And then I would hope, exactly like your point, if God's knowledge doesn't track reality as reality changes, then he's not omniscient. So you would hope that God's knowledge would be different from, I'm not doing anything, to, oh, I'm doing some stuff now. Like, which it sounds very trivial, because you're like, well, yeah, surely God's knowledge is going to track that. But yeah, it's dynamic in a sense, right? Because it is like, he wasn't doing it and his knowledge now changes.
Right. And so that's right. Exactly. And so Dale, let me jump to this next question then real quick, and then I'll let you kind of comment on 4 and 5 as well. But this seems to be, from my understanding, and I could be totally off on this, but that seems to be the reason that these guys are affirming things like this is because of the essence and energies distinction. So my question then is, if you have, and feel free, if you haven't done a lot of study on this, just pass it off to Dale, and then he can comment on the questions that I just asked. But I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about the essence and energies distinction in relation to the topic of God and time, just in general?
Yeah, so I've read about this in the past, and then I'm in a debate book with David Bradshaw on divine simplicity, and so I just wrote up my response to his chapter just a few days ago. So he lays out the essence energy distinction there. So at least here's how he lays it out in this forthcoming paper. You've got this essence, which is ineffable, unknowable. And then you've got these attributes and these actions that are extramentally distinct from each other and from the essence. Extramentally meaning it doesn't exist just in my head. Like, in reality, these things are actually distinct from the essence.
Right.
And that seems fine to me. What I find interesting is that is identical to this view in the Western Abrahamic traditions called the attributionist view, which explicitly says divine simplicity is false.
Okay.
And it also says God's not made up of parts. Like, why would God be made up of parts? Attributes are not parts. Actions are not. Stop it. Just stop it. No.
Yeah.
Like, God's not made up of parts, but he has attributes. You want to deny God has attributes? Well, you don't know how to read the Bible. You don't know how to read the Quran. You don't know, this is the way these arguments go in history. So
Right.
when I see Palamos or something like this making this kind of claim, I'm like, well, Palamos is accused in his own day of denying divine simplicity. I'm like, oh, I wonder why. Maybe because there's this widespread view called the attributionist view that explicitly says simplicity is false, and you're articulating a view that is identical
Yeah.
to that. And I'm like, that's fine, because I think simplicity is false. So I'm like, this sounds cool.
Mhm.
What Bradshaw lays out too, not simply are God's actions and attributes distinct from the essence.
Mhm.
It's also the case, he says, that some of God's actions are actions that he did not always perform. He has some new contingent actions that he was not always performing. And I'm
Right.
like, this is identical to my view, except for one thing. Here's the only thing that's not identical to my view. I don't have any room for an ineffable essence in my theology, because I
Right.
don't know what that is, nor could I know what an ineffable essence is, nor could I even know if I could talk about it, because if I could talk about it, well, then I already know too much about it.
It's not
So
ineffable.
Right. So I want to get rid of these kind of things. So as far as I can tell, the essence energy distinction is identical to my view, but it has this ineffable mystery thrown in there.
Right.
If there's more to the story, I'm happy to hear, but that's as far as I've been able to gather is what this distinction is.
And I think that's fair, because in reading your book, that's kind of what I was thinking the entire time. I know you mentioned the essence energies distinction in the book, but I'm like, man, if this dude was orthodox, he would be just calling it essence energies distinction. But you're right.
Yeah.
And Ryan, I think you've convinced me of what you were just saying in your book and just now, that if ineffability is a genuine characteristic of God's essence, right? And let me preface what I'm about to say with this. I'm not an Orthodox priest. I'm not a bishop. I'm a layman that was just newly baptized in the Orthodox Church. So I don't speak for the Orthodox Church, and I'm willing to change my mind on things if proven wrong. So with that being said, it seems like these guys that say things like the ineffability of God and then go on, as you stated in your book, to write how many pages, how much ink has been spilled on the ineffability of God. You're right. It seems like an internal contradiction to say God's essence or whatever is ineffable, and then to go on and write a 30-page article about that very thing. So,
Yeah.
Anyway,
You know too much about something you can't know anything about. I mean, that's
right.
just, yeah. And and I've read a lot of these different claims. Like some of the people you had Jonathan Jacobs on, like he's got this really interesting paper on it, where ineffability is supposed to be this view that we cannot make any fundamental claims, no fundamental claims about God are fundamentally true. And I'm like, ineffability, the way you're stating it sounds like it's supposed to be a fundamentally true claim that's fundamental about. Okay, well then that's self-contradictory. My former mentor, Keith Yandel, has this paper. It's from like the 70s. And all he does is just tries to articulate what ineffability is supposed to be without contradiction. And he did this thing that was like really typical of analytic philosophy at the time, where you're like, here's a definition. That doesn't work. Let me fix it. Let me try definition again. So it's like definition, star, definition, star. And you just keep chopping away. And after like 20 different attempts, he's like, yeah, I don't know. I can't make sense of this. I'm like, give it more effort than most people would, I guess. But yeah, it's an ongoing problem. And it's an ongoing problem that a lot of people, like Michael Scott, not from The Office, but the philosopher of language.
Right.
He has a really good book on religious language and a really good paper on apophaticism, where he says this is the main problem with apophaticism, is figuring out how do we state this without contradicting ourselves. So it's an ongoing project, like research project.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It would make sense to me if they would, and maybe, I mean, I don't know, if we would have got some of the old saints, of old, to sit down with us today and we hash some of these things out, I think we would be in line with a lot of the things that they said, obviously. And maybe it's just, this progressive language, how we talk about things today. You see what I'm saying? Like they would probably, I would hope, say, yeah, we agree with that. So maybe instead of saying ineffable, like God's essence is beyond us, or something to that effect. But don't say you can't talk about it and then talk about it.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
There's a distinction that we have now that I've seen various people like Lorraine Keller and Ali-Pekka Vainio, and I think Edith Stein made this distinction too, to say this is what we think they were going on about with ineffability. So there's propositional knowledge and there's experiential knowledge. So I can state that the rain in Spain falls mostly on the plain, and you can know that, and we can talk about it.
Yeah.
There's something that it's like to actually experience the rain falling. And I was in Spain just a couple of weeks ago and there was no rain. And so I didn't experience this, but it was just dreadfully hot. But there's something that it's like to experience that. And that experiential knowledge is not reducible to propositional knowledge.
Right.
So what some people are suggesting is when different patristics, when they were talking about this ineffability of God, what they're saying is, there's an experience of God, and you can't, I mean, you can give all the propositions. God is holy, God is good, God is blah, blah, blah. But that's not you cannot reduce your experience of God down to propositions, because experiential knowledge is not reducible to propositional knowledge. Mm-hmm. So there's something, so you can describe God to the best of your abilities, because, you're not going to get God right perfectly, I'm guessing, unless you have an ability that I don't have. I don't know. But it's going to be different than experiencing God. Like, it's one thing to say God is holy, and then another thing to be like Isaiah in that experience of going, oh my gosh, I am in front of a holy God. Like that's just, those are very different things. And if that's what ineffability is getting at, then I'm like, oh, okay, well that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you for explaining that. I appreciate that. Dale, I told you I'd give you the mic after this, so go on.
Yeah. So I don't have much to contribute because I'm not Eastern Orthodox. I don't go for the essence energies thing. And I don't know what John of Damascus meant. But I do have one follow-up just before I go to question 6. And I am kind of curious because me and Tyler were actually talking the other day about the Orthodox have this notion when you're in the church, you're actually timelessly entering into the presence of God or in heaven or something with all the saints. So I don't know if that's the official position of the Orthodox Church or not, but wouldn't that have to imply?
Think so.
It is, yeah. So
I put it like this: I know in the Divine Liturgy they say something, and I don't have the Divine Liturgy memorized, so forgive me if I mess a couple words up here. But paraphrase, basically, we're going to remember, in doing this, we're remembering the second coming. Well, how in the world do you remember the second coming if it hasn't happened yet? And so there's this idea of participating, and the same goes with the Eucharist, right? Like, we are experiencing and participating in the same sacrifice that Jesus offered 2,000 years ago in the year 2024. Now, I can't get philosophical about that because I don't know how that works. Maybe, Ryan, you can shed some light on that. But with that being said, yes, so because it's mentioned in the Divine Liturgy, Dale, I would say that's the quote-unquote Orthodox, position on that.
Okay, so yeah, so my question was going to be like, well, wouldn't that mean that God would have to be timeless? Although there is a sense of tense, right? Because even though it's a future event, they're remembering, so they're not actually experiencing. So to me, it looks like a mess, but like, I'm kind of curious, what is that about?
Yeah. So I don't know if it's the official claim, but I see it a lot. I've seen it a lot in a lot of Eastern Orthodox thinkers and a lot of mystical theologians. You see it a lot in near-death experience literature. This claim that you've got these significant moments where you are able to transcend time itself. And so I've got another forthcoming book that should be out hopefully in a few months as well, called Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God. And I've got a section in there where I try to distinguish different kinds of questions that people ask about time. And I say there's the really boring question, what is time? And that's the one no one's interested in. What people always want to jump to are significant events in history. Like, that's what people are really interested in. So when you see these kind of mystical stories or accounts of, like, somehow transcending time in a near-death experience or in the liturgy or something like that, I think what people are really trying to do is they're trying to figure out, how do I best capture this incredibly significant moment in history or this event? And sometimes words fail you to do that. And so we give a mishmash of different metaphors and whatnot. And then sometimes we'll say it's timeless. And I'm like, okay, so let's see here. To be timeless is to exist without succession and without temporal location. You walked into the church and then it became timeless,
Look,
and then you sing some song, you know. So
I don't
you
know
see
if
what I'm-
any. Look, I don't know if you guys have stepped foot in an Orthodox church before, but I promise you, my clock still works when I'm worshiping. Like, I know
Yeah.
that for a fact. I've looked, and it's there. You know, it's
Yeah.
ticking away. So yeah, go ahead.
And then at some point, yeah, like the mystical experience ended, or the worship service ended, and because it was so significant, you remembered it happening, and sometimes it was so significant you remember the exact date when that happened because it was such significant. It's like you know, it was so much more significant than like all the mundane stuff that I typically go through, and I'm like, that's totally fine. But just when we say it's timeless, we're just speaking metaphorically, I think, at best. If you want to try to take it literally, it can't be timeless because if you're remembering something that you've already brought in time, and you're talking about a future event, so you've already brought in time, so it would be an absolute mess to take it literally. So I think it's best to take it as a metaphor that captures something of this is how significant it is that we have mixed metaphors to try to capture it.
I like that. I really appreciate that explanation, Ryan. So, Dale.
Awesome. Yeah, me too, because that was something I just learned about, and that was kind of puzzling me. So
I just don't see, like, this is just from my perspective, like, I don't see a bunch of priests getting together, right, and saying, how do we literally describe this? But if somebody wrote the Divine Liturgy, and we do the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, like, I could see, and I do see a lot of, like, I call it, like, psalm language, right, where you use poetic language to describe these experiences that you have, right? But it's just like it's almost extremes. Like you've got a lot of hyperbole, you've got a lot of this and that. And that seems like I don't think what they're literally saying is that we are timeless, right? But metaphorically describing the significance of the event, like Ryan said. So no, I appreciate that.
awesome. All right, cool. So I kind of want to switch gears to look at the issue of divine simplicity. And from my understanding, in your book, you actually give a couple of arguments against it on the basis of it leads to modal collapse in your view. So, yeah, do you kind of want to outline what those were about and take it away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a modal collapse. So let's talk about what that is first. So we've got these different distinctions in modal logic. Modal logic tries to look at what's necessarily the case, what's possible, what's contingent. So we've got these distinct kind of categories. Something's necessary, meaning it has to be that way. Something's contingent, meaning it doesn't have to be that way. When you get a modal collapse, it's when all these different distinct categories get collapsed down to one. So you could have a modal collapse where everything's contingent, nothing's necessary. Or the one that you see more often in philosophy and in history is modal collapse into everything's necessary, like this full-blown necessitarian kind of view. Like you see this in Avicenna or Ibn Sina, for example. Like he's got this full-blown sort of necessitarian view that comes from his beliefs about divine simplicity. So here's the claim. So the claim is, first off, like strictly speaking, God does not have any attributes at all. But we have this way of talking where everything you want to attribute to God or everything you want to predicate of God has to be identical to God. So all that is in God is God. This is what Augustine says. And so anything you want to predicate of God, that has to be numerically identical to God. So all of God's attributes have to be identical to each other and identical to God. All of God's actions have to be identical to each other and identical to God. So his act of creating the universe, his act of answering your prayer from the other night, those all have to be identical to his existence.
That's gross.
Now, it's weird. It's super weird. But what's funny to me is I've been doing this for years, and most of the time, just me simply just stating this is what the doctrine says, just explicitly. This is just what the doctrine says. Most people go, "I'm out." Like I've already checked out, and I'm like, let's keep going. But I get it because it's nuts. Like I really do struggle to go, why was this view popular in various circles throughout history? And I can easily see why it's wildly unpopular in other circles throughout history, because they're just like, you're denying the attributes of God. Didn't you read the Quran? You know, like when you see that, like, you know, very early on. Anyway, so you've got all these identity claims going on.
I just want to say there's a reason appeal to popularity is a fallacy. So
Fair enough.
Yeah. And also the popularity is amongst some professional like academic theologians, I'm guessing the average old lady that went to church was probably not going, no, these attributes are all identical. I'm not sure they're not doing that. Come on. Anyway, so God's existed. He necessarily exists. He exists of absolute necessity.
Yeah.
Now, anything that's identical to that existence is going to have the same modal status on pain of violating identity. So if God's act to create this universe is identical to his existence, it's going to have to be absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. So all the kind of distinctions that different classical theists want to make about, well, God's act to create it's not absolutely necessary. It's hypothetically necessary. It's conditional necessity. It's really contingent. No, because if it's really identical to God's existence, then it's going to be absolutely necessary. So what you get is God's act to create this particular universe is absolutely necessary. Now, that by itself might not get you a modal collapse. So you just bring in one other assumption that pretty much every classical theist wants to affirm, which is the infallibility of God's omnipotence. If God wills to bring about something, then it has to come about. End of story. Mm-hmm. So if God intentionally wills to bring about this universe, well, then it has to exist. And what people like Aquinas or Scotus or a lot of Bonaventure or a lot of people in the Middle Ages, they notice right away, okay, given the infallibility of omnipotence, if God's action really is strictly identical to his absolutely necessary existence, you're going to get this modal collapse. It's going to be absolutely necessary. And so they try to do all sorts of fudging to try to be like, it's no problem. And I'm like, everything you affirm entails that this act necessarily exists. And since it's an infallible, omnipotent act, everything follows. So you get this full blown, everything's necessary, nothing's contingent. Now, is that a big deal? Some people just shrug their shoulders. So like Avicenna, for example, he's going to be like, look, you wanted an argument for the existence of God. I gave you one. Oh, you don't like that everything's necessary? Why don't you go cry about it? Like, what do you want? Like, I just, I gave you some really cool proofs for God. Yeah. Catherine Rogers, she's a little bit more bothered by it, but not too much. She's just like, well, let's not call it a modal collapse because it sounds like stuff's falling on you. And that's bad. You don't want things falling on you. Let's call it modal simplicity. Like it's a really simple view of, and so I'm like, ooh, that's smooth. That's, but she is trying to figure out like, what's the big deal? And I remember sitting in the room with her and Brian Leftow, going, you should be in real estate because you know how to sell stuff. Like, he's like, this just can't be right because think about all the things that seem contingent. Could I have worn a different shirt today? Could I have sat slightly to the left or slightly to the right? These all things like yeah, they seem possible. But on a modal collapse, no, not at all. Think about the grace that God gave you. Did he have to give you that grace? Typically we say, well, no, it's grace. Like it's not the sort of thing God has to give you. But on a modal collapse, there's no other way things could be. He has to give you the grace. You think about the problem of evil. A lot of times we say God could have prevented this evil. He could have prevented this evil from happening, could have stopped it, but he had a good reason not to. If a modal collapse is the case, he could not have prevented this evil. Like there's no way anything else could have been. So it really, I think it has a very erosive effect. Like there's no free will for God or creatures. All of our intuitions are completely wrong. All the things we want to say in our theology are completely wrong. I think it's a very serious problem.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, Tyler just had to step away for a second. So you're stuck with me, unfortunately. But,
that's okay.
Awesome. So yeah, the last question on Tyler's list is kind of geared to something I'm interested in. So it's looking at William Lane Craig's view, of that we kind of mentioned before. What do you think would be some of the presuppositions that someone who holds that view would have to give up theologically?
Like Craig's view or just timelessness will stop? Because those are different questions and I can answer either. Doesn't matter.
It looks like he's asking about Craig's view in particular here. Yeah.
Okay. So with Craig's view, the main thing I think you have to give up with Craig's view is the underlying theory of time that he has. So he has a relational or what's sometimes called a reductionist theory of time. So let me explain that. So on my absolute theory of time, time is this fundamental feature of reality. Like it cannot be reduced to something else. I cannot reduce it away to some non-temporal thing. On the relational theory of time, what you're trying to do is you're trying to say time's not a fundamental feature of reality, or at least it's not a thing in our ontology. Instead, we can reduce it away to some non-temporal thing. And so what I want to say, and what you'll see me do in the forthcoming book on divine temporality, is I'll lay out all the different attempts to reduce it away to some non-temporal thing and show that in each case you snuck in time. So here's an example of this. So a lot of relational theorists will say, okay, we need to find some non-temporal thing in our ontology to reduce time down to. Events. We'll reduce it down to events. Time is just a relationship between events or something like that. I'm like, cool. Okay, now tell me what an event is, and you better not sneak time into the story because you're trying to reduce time away to events. So if you sneak time into the story, you've got this horrible circularity on your hands. And I'm like, okay, cool. Here's what an event is. An event is a substance having a property at a time. And I'm like, well, now hang on. Yeah, the one rule was like, don't sneak time into the story. And so I pointed this out to Craig because in his philosophical foundations for a Christian worldview, him and JP Moreland, this is how they define events is like substances having properties at a time. And so Craig was like, well, maybe we should just revise that definition of events and stuff. I'm like, cool story, but like, now you've got to explain how these events are related to one another. And again, that relationship better not be simultaneity, because that's the temporal one. Better not be earlier or later then, because that's, again, we're sneaking time back into the story. And I just don't know how you do this. So Ulrich Mayer is a philosopher of time. He does this. I'm following his footsteps in this. So he does the same thing, going, here's all the definitions of events, then from all the major metaphysicians, and every single one of them sneaks in time. And Galen, he actually had the same kind of argument against Aristotle. And you see Aristotle constantly flubbing like back and forth going, well, time's not exactly change. It's kind of like change, but like, he's always like kind of like faffing around to avoid these exact kind of circularity problems. And I just don't know how you can do that. So if you like Craig's view, you have to get out of the circularity problem. If you are going to reject Craig's view and go to mine, I think that would be the big philosophical change you would have to make. You just go, okay, I'm going to get rid of the relational theory of time, and I'm going to affirm the absolute theory of time. And so, on the absolute theory, time can exist without change. So there's no reason to say that this sans creation is a timeless state of affairs. It's just a temporal state of affairs. It's a very long way of saying I'm right, Craig's wrong. I mean, it's like that, but that's the big idea.
Fair enough. All right. Tyler, over to you. What do you want to go to audience questions, or you have a question for me, or?
Well, if Ryan, if you're okay with that, we do have a couple audience questions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind answering audience questions?
Yeah, it's fine.
All right, bet. Okay, so Dale has to hard stop here in about 20 minutes. I know he's got another show lined up at 11 o'clock. I definitely want to give you some time to get there.
I'm not enjoying this philosophy of time. Unlike you two, I have not had enough. I'm going to continue because I still find it fascinating. So yeah.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. All right. So if you have a question, we do have some questions come in. If you have a question, put at Faith Unaltered, and I will see it in the chat. If you want your question to move up to the top of the list, hit us with a super chat. You can do that by clicking the $sign at the bottom of your video and following the all on-screen instructions from there. And the first question is, where is Ryan's nail polish?
I actually removed my nail polish this morning before getting on because it wasn't looking good. So yeah. Oh. So I actually removed it like an hour before we started recording.
Now I got to know, what's the story with the nail polish? I feel like there's a super awesome story behind this. So
there's really not. No, it's just okay. You go to a heavy metal show, you go to a goth dance party,
Yeah.
You want to just look cool, put on some nail polish,
a few times.
What I usually tell like a lot of my fans is when people get really animated about it in the chats on a lot of these live videos, like, what's up with his nails? Like, why is he doing this? Is there some like political agenda there? And so what I tell a lot of people who listen to my podcast, I'm like, just tell them I'm a Satanist. It's fine. Just and so they'll say like, the worst I did. I didn't feel bad about this at all. So one guy was like really like upset going on about my nails, and I was like, I have a medical condition. I don't like to talk about it. Thanks for bringing too much attention to it. And he's like, I'm very sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm just like, he actually believed that. What is this?
See, Dale, you could do that with the sunglasses thing because you actually do have that medical condition where light is sensitive to you. Because we get asked all the time, why in the world does Dale wear sunglasses? And I'm just like, because he wants to look cool. Like, that's the coolest way to do it.
In
Like,
the first place, in the first place, that should be good enough. Like I'm the kind of guy, like it's weird when people are like, oh, what are you, if Tim Pool wants to wear a beanie, okay. If you want to wear socks and sandals, okay. I don't care really, but yeah, like for me, I actually do have a medical thing with my eye. In fact, I was struggling right at the beginning of this show because I rubbed it the wrong way, so I had to go, clean it out and stuff like that. But so I do have a medical thing, but
well, I think I've got a more extreme story than both of y'all. Right before, so we were going to interview Archbishop Angelakis over demonic possession, and right before we went live, I was going to wear a pig mask. Before he came on, like I was going to do the pig mask, and then the last second, I was like, I've never met this dude before. Maybe I shouldn't. And I pulled it off the last second, so I scrapped that idea. But that was going to be a thing, and the pig mask is going to come in an interview sometime in the future. If you want to see that, make sure you're a member, because that will be a members only live stream for sure. But yeah, so the pig mask is definitely going to make a return, or a debut, I should say. So it will happen at one point. But all right, right on. So the nail polish. So you're a metalhead. Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
That's the answer. All right, right on. A guy at work just introduced me to a band, Spirit Box, and I've been listening to them lately. I don't know if you're familiar. But Spirit Box is definitely an interest. I love a chick that can growl and then clean it up like from verse to chorus. And so
She's
that
good.
just yes, very arch enemy. So anyway, to get back to the audience questions, we're gonna transition into a metal talk. But okay, so BJ Allen asked, was he, and I'm assuming he means the Son, always incarnate? No, but he always knew he was going to incarnate, right? Or timelessly, he just knows it, right? Do you need BJ to kind of elaborate on that, or do you get the general concept?
Yeah, I get the idea. It depends on what you think about your doctrine of providence and omniscience. So if you're like a theological determinist, so like a Thomist or a Calvinist, even though some Thomists will be like, we don't affirm this, and I'm like, okay, fine. Other Thomists are like, yeah, it's just determinism. If you've got some view like that, or you've got a scotistic view, or you're a Mollinist, or you're a Calvinist, there's this dirty little secret that nobody likes to talk about. And so I try to exploit it a lot in my forthcoming book, Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God, and a paper that I just published that just came out called Does Providence Entail Divine Temporality? Maybe. Because they let me get away with a cheeky title finally. Anyway, yeah, because a lot of times these journals are like, that's not very professional. And I'm like, oh my gosh, do you have a sense of humor? Do you like entertaining writing style? No, they don't.
No.
Anyway, no is the answer.
No.
Here is the dirty little secret everybody looks over. So you've got these logical moments supposedly in the life of God. And at the first logical moment, there's this thing called natural knowledge. What does God know then? God knows he knows his own nature. That's why it's called natural knowledge. And so what this knowledge of his own nature gives him is knowledge of all the necessary truths. It does not give him knowledge of any contingent truths. It does not give him any knowledge of what God would do in any possible circumstance, nor knowledge of what God will do. Why? Because he hasn't yet decided to do anything. And so the claim is there are no counterfactuals of divine freedom at the moment of natural knowledge. So at that moment, does God know that he will become incarnate? No, because he doesn't even know if he's even just going to create a universe. You don't get that knowledge until several logical moments later, when God finally makes a decision to just create in general and then create a particular timeline. And once God freely creates that timeline, then God gets this thing called free knowledge, which is knowledge of what he's freely decided to bring about. So people will try to do what they'll try to do is they'll try to embed all of these different logical moments into God's timeless life. So that way you get the claim from all of eternity, timeless eternity, God knew he would become incarnate. Right. But you get a contradiction, because what you have from all eternity, God does not know he will become incarnate, because that moment of natural knowledge, and God knows he will become incarnate. And so I'm like, okay, so you've got an eternal contradiction now in the life of God. And that's just one. We can pile up a million. I want to get rid of that. I don't want eternal contradictions in God.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think another place this really shines through is in Calvinism, specifically in the infra and supralapsarian debate. That's what they're debating, is those logical moments. And if you just get rid of those and say, well, no, those are actually temporal moments, then you don't run into the problems like you just described.
Exactly. And so that's what I do in the Does Providence Entail Temporality? Maybe is exactly this. And I talk a bit about the infra supra debate and stuff like that, and just kind of go, this is really weird. You're going to get a million contradictions. Let's just not do that. Let's just make these temporal moments. Like, come on. Like,
Right. All right. No, fair enough. Okay, so before I put this next question on the screen, this is something that you and I briefly discussed in our chats, and that I had it lined up. I was going through your article about Paul, or responding to Paul Helm with the idea that divine temporality entails Arianism. Now, I guess, and in that article, no, I take it back. It was in the book. You had said he has recently, or when the book was written anyway, softened his blow or softened his language in response to that. And so this next question has to do exactly with that. I was planning on actually discussing this with you, but I will say this. If you're willing to come back for a part 2, this would be the first question I would lead with in that discussion,
sure.
if you'd be willing to do that. But if you want to give just a brief summary of your view on this, Chris asked, if God is necessarily temporal, would that have any implication for the Father begetting the Son? Does a cause need to be temporally prior to the effect?
Right. Yeah. So I'll give a brief answer, and then, like you said, we could do the full answer on another episode.
Awesome.
So if you affirm that causes are temporally prior to their effects, which I think is a very reasonable thing to affirm, you get this problem. So the Father causes the Son to exist. That's what eternal begottenness means, is cause. And you're like, well, gosh, now. So the cause is temporally before the effect. That means the Father is temporally. There's a time when the Father existed without the Son.
There's a
What
time
was
when
that?
the
Well, that
Son
was
was
Arianism.
not. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So you're like, oh gosh, that's really bad. So what you could try to do is you could try to say maybe causes are simultaneous with their effects. I don't think that really gets you anywhere, because that's a really weird and counterintuitive kind of view. Or what you could do is just go, hang on, the Bible never says that the Father causes the Son to exist. What is this? And hang on, I thought to be God was to not have a cause for your existence. Well, maybe let's just not say the Father caused the Son to exist. Maybe we can say the Father sent the Son to become incarnate, and that's a pretty unique and cool thing. That's a biblical statement. But maybe let's just stop saying the Father caused the Son to exist. Those are some options. That's the short version.
Right. No, I appreciate that. All right. And then just if anybody was wondering, that's where I was like, oh man, whenever I was reading your book. So I would love to flesh that out with you more, because I think it definitely deserves an episode in and of itself, because that's a huge topic.
And I've got a lot of material on it. William Hasker and I have 2 published debates on this. There's a lot of material on it. It's interesting.
Okay, right on. Well, I think I was talking to my godfather. I think you might know him, Dr. Bo Branson, and he said that you and I, or you and him, were going to discuss something about the Trinity.
Correct.
Here in the future. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. Let me. So I am co-editing a book series on the doctrine of God with John Peckham. And we got a bunch of different books in the series, one of which is 4 Views on the Trinity book that Chad McIntosh is editing, and Bo is in there. And so my summer interns and I are setting up podcast interviews with all the contributors. So we're talking with Bo right now to try to figure out exact dates of when to interview on this. So
nice. This is the full circle then, because Bo's been telling me he's been writing this book, and he's pretty much got it done. It's just waiting to be published. Okay, so you're the guy. Okay, fair enough.
So Chad's the main one editing it. It's just in my book series, and I think we're just waiting on the copy editor to do her thing on that at the moment. So it's hopefully this year.
Okay, fair enough. Small world. Yeah. That's awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah.
All right. So the last question. Oh, Dale, did you want to jump in?
Oh no, I was just going to bring up the last question kind of thing, but yeah.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So Sam, so question number 2, does a divine atemporalist have an out that keeps them from collapsing into pantheism or panentheism? And he says, I can't seem to find any.
Yeah. So to avoid pantheism is very easy, because pantheism says God and the universe are identical. All you have to do is go, yeah, God created a bunch of physical stuff and some immaterial souls, and that's all distinct from God. There you go. Like that's it. So it's very easy to avoid pantheism. And now panentheism, in one sense, it's easy to avoid. In another sense, it's not. Here's the sense in which it's easy to avoid. I cannot for the life of me figure out what panentheism is. I have published 5 or 6 papers on this. I'm supposed to be a world-leading expert on panentheism. I've been asked to defend the view in different publications, and I've done that. I still can't figure out what it is, because it's a group of people who love to throw around metaphors, but they won't tell me what the metaphors point towards. And sometimes it's metaphors they stole from like Augustine or other classical theists. So here's the best I can figure out what panentheism is. So panentheism denies creation out of nothing, and says that God has to create something of some sort. And so you'll see this from a lot of different panentheists, but notice I said a lot, not all. Mm-hmm. So like Benedict Goeke, who's one of the greatest defenders of panentheism in Germany, he says, yeah, God has to create. Thomas J. Ord, who's a contemporary panentheist as well. He, same thing. It's like God has to create a universe of some sort. Mm-hmm. There's maybe some discretion about which universe comes into existence, but he has to create a universe of some sort. In the Hindu tradition, it's very common to say creation ex nihilo is false. And it's very common to describe different Hindu theories of God as panentheist. They're like, we're monotheists, we affirm God just like you guys do, but it's a panentheism. We reject creation out of nothing. I'm like, well, tell me what that is. And I'm like, well, does that mean that God has to create the universe? And they're like, no, he's eternally creating the universe, but he doesn't have to. And so I've got this book on panentheism in Indian and Western philosophy that I contribute to. And one of the editors is a Swami, and he's like, yeah, we don't affirm that the necessity of creation. And I'm like, well, now I don't know what panentheism is, because I thought this was the thing. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you other than creation ex nihilo is false. What else is up for grabs? So if you want to avoid panentheism, just say creation ex nihilo is true.
So with that, just as a quick follow-up, I hear the word or the phrase tossed around, Palamite panentheism. But I would think Gregory Palamas would affirm like that God didn't have to create, like there was a free choice there being made. So is that something that's different, or we just don't know?
I think when I look at all the literature on panentheism, I've read a lot of it because, again, I'm supposed to be like one of the leading experts on it. Again, when I see like the Palamite discussions on it, I just go, okay, cool. You've got this metaphor that like God's like in the world and the world's in God. And I'm like, that's great. Cool. What does that metaphor mean? And that's always the question. And I don't know. Sometimes it just means God's omnipresent. And I'm like, well, who denies that God's like omnipresent? No one
there
does.
Has to be a distinction here.
Yeah. And so that's the big problem I lay out, what's called the demarcation problem in my very first paper on it, which is called the difficulty of demarcating panentheism. What I do is I go, here's all these models of God. They're all easy to demarcate from one another, except for panentheism. If you define it this way, well, that's just open theism. You define it this way, that's just classical theism. Define it, well, that's just pantheism. What's your view? Tell me what your view.
Yeah, there has to be a middle.
We'll just wait and see if someday somebody will define what panentheism is.
Fair enough. And while we wait, the clock keeps ticking. But Dr. Mullins, I really appreciate this discussion. I appreciate you coming on and talking with us about this. I hope you had a good time. I know I did for sure. And I know Dale did. I think I can speak for him on that. My audience is super into this conversation. And so I would love to have you back if that would be something you'd like to do in the near future. And talk really about the begetting of the Son, because that's a concept that I think really would affect all of us. And yeah, I was just very interested in, like, once I saw that in the book, The End of the Timeless God. By the way, go buy that book for our audience. But I was just like, I got to have more on this. So that's why I went to your article about Paul Helm, and now I want more. So with that being said, I'd love to talk to you about that. Dale, thank you for joining me, my friend. Thank you to our audience that has hung out with us. Dale has got another discussion lined up here in about 5 minutes. So we'll be right back. Now, Dale, this is going to be broadcast on Faith Unaltered too, since David's joining you. Is that right?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and he wants me there about 5 minutes early, so like
All right.
right about now. So I'm sorry for rushing this. I do.
No,
enjoy
you're good, bro.
There's no disrespect. It's a bad
Yeah.
scheduling thing, but yeah, I would love to be on when you come back and we can breathe, and let's just take as long as we need. So yeah, but thank you for having me on.
All right, and Ryan, your YouTube channel is The Reluctant Theologian. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Fair enough. So go subscribe to Ryan if you aren't yet. Go buy his book, The End of the Timeless God, and we will see you next time. Or here in about 5 minutes. Dale and David will. So with that being said, good night. God bless, and know that you are loved.